Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're listening to us. Today, we're honored to have as a special guest and main speaker, Professor Daniel A. Bell, who will help us understand the identity and development of China's political system. Professor Daniel A. Bell is Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University and Distinguished Chair Professor at Fudan University. He's from Montreal and was educated at McGill University and Oxford University. He has held teaching posts in Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Beijing, and research fellowships at Princeton, Stanford, and Hebrew University. He's a worldwide well-respected author in political science and Chinese politics and philosophy. Among his extensive work, we could highlight China's New Confucianism, the China Model, which today's discussion is based on, and Just Hierarchy, his latest book, co-authored with Wang. Moreover, he's founding editor of the Princeton China series, which translates and publishes original and influential academic works from China. Definitely, Professor Daniel A. Bell is a contemporary intellectual leader recognized by the World Economic Forum, whose ideas and work are setting a new path on how we should understand China itself, as well as its relationships with the West. Given the confronting democracy authoritarianism narrative that dominates China-West public discourse, it's essential to focus on the core concepts that define China from within, like political meritocracy. In addition, we need to comprehend how China embraces democracy and the social-political challenges that we'll face in the near future, such as gradually involving society in decision-making. In the end, the West needs to learn from China as China has been learning from the West. Without further delay, we're pleased to welcome Professor Daniel A. Bell. The floor is yours.
Is that we tend to divide the political world into two kind of spheres. One is called the democratic sphere, and the other is called the authoritarian or autocratic sphere. And we see it very explicitly in the US leadership now, where President Biden says there's two types of countries, the democracies, which are good, and the autocratic ones, which have no values or bad values. But it's also a kind of popular trope in the media, as well as among intellectuals and let's say ordinary people as well. So is this a useful way of dividing the political world? Well, I think it's not very helpful if you want to understand China, because for one thing, if we use this framework to understand China, then we think over the past 4 decades, there's been no political reform because China was an autocratic country and it's still an autocratic country. An autocratic country means all those forms of government which don't use elections as a way of selecting political leaders. Since China doesn't use elections to select its top political leaders, it means that it's an autocracy and its basic nature hasn't changed over the past 40 or 50 years. Now, anybody who knows anything about China would question that assumption that there's been no change or no political reform over the past 40 or 50 years. The political system now is hugely different than what it was in the chaotic periods of the Cultural Revolution, which was a 10-year effort to destroy a kind of bureaucratic rule. Since the Cultural Revolution, starting from the late 1970s, there's been an effort to reestablish a kind of bureaucratic form of government where public officials are selected and promoted based on ability and virtue. And basically, that's the huge difference, not just between the Chinese government now and the Chinese government during the Cultural Revolution, but also between the Chinese government and other countries that are lumped into the same category of autocracy, like family-run dictatorships in North Korea, military dictatorships in Myanmar and Egypt, say, or family-run monarchies like in Saudi Arabia. China is none of those. What exactly differs? So even though they all fall into the same autocratic camp, but it doesn't capture what's really different and unique about China, both in terms of its own historical trajectory and compared to other countries that don't use elections to select top leaders, i.e. so-called autocracies. And the big difference is that there's been a very serious effort to reestablish a form of political meritocracy over the past 4 decades. And what this means, political meritocracy, is this idea in Chinese, it's xian neng zheng zhi. It's a very old ideal. Basically, it was also, except for the emperor in the imperial system, let's say for at least 1,300 years, public officials were selected first by examinations and then by performance evaluations at lower levels of government. Now, that same kind of government or political system has been reestablished, at least imperfectly, over the past 4 decades. There's been an effort to, on the one hand, it's a political ideal where the aim is to select and promote public officials with superior or above average political virtue and ability. On the other hand, it's also a practice or institution in the form of very complex bureaucracy, which precisely aims to select public officials with a superior ability and virtue. Now, of course, there's a big gap between the ideal and the reality, right? We know that, for example, corruption is a serious problem. Certainly, the Chinese leaders recognize that and have launched the most systematic anti-corruption campaign in modern Chinese history. Because what does it mean to select public officials with superior ability and virtue? Well, virtue means at bottom that the public officials should serve the community instead of serving themselves. If they're corrupt, it means the opposite of that. It means that they're misusing public funds for their own or their family interests. So there's an effort to close the gap between the ideal and the reality. You know, like any other political system, political meritocracy has lots of disadvantages, right? If you don't use elections to select political leaders, how do you limit their power? How do you stop corruption in the political system? We need to discuss that. Also, hierarchies can become ossified. How do we, because the ideal of political meritocracy assumes that everybody has the equal opportunity to be put on the road to political power through meritocratic mechanisms such as examinations and performance evaluations. But it doesn't always happen that way. How do we break down political hierarchies that ossify? There are some disadvantages in the political system that help to explain the gap between the ideal and the reality. But I'm going to argue that it's important to use the ideal to evaluate what counts as political progress and regress in China. Political progress means that the gap between the ideal and reality of political meritocracy has been reduced, and regress means that it's been increased. Now, some may think, this sounds a little bit dangerous. Does it mean that China is against democracy? Well, no, not at all, because this political ideal of political meritocracy is fully compatible with most democratic values and practices at the level of principle. For example, elections at lower to mid levels of government are probably a good way of selecting public officials because the people have more direct experience with the leaders that they select. They probably, for example, in a village, the leaders, the people know who's corrupt, who's not, who's a good person, who's not. So it makes sense to have elections at lower levels of government. Other democratic ideals and practices like deliberative democracy or widespread consultation or freedom to criticize the government. These are all compatible and in fact probably are necessary part of any desirable form of political meritocracy. Again, there's a gap between the ideal and the reality, but in principle, political meritocracy is fully compatible with democracy. With one exception, though. Political meritocracy is not compatible with elections to select leaders at higher levels of government, at the highest levels of government. Why is that? Well, because you have to think, what are the advantages of political meritocracy? And those advantages are likely to be undermined by elections at higher levels of government. For example, in a political meritocracy, all leaders have political experience, right? They have to go through decades of training and meritocratic hoops, so to speak, to be promoted. So by almost, given the Chinese political system, we can be sure that nobody who's at higher political levels of government is all leaders at higher levels of government will have some political experience. If there's elections are used to select leaders at higher levels of government, then somebody with no political experience can be selected. I mean, obviously, a good example would be Donald Trump in the US, who became president with zero political experience. His only experience was being a businessman, and arguably these kind of standards of success in business are totally different than standards of success in government, right? I mean, if you're in a capitalist economy, what's a successful business? One that makes a profit. That means you have to serve those who perform well, and as opposed to those who don't perform well. But in a government, in politics, almost the opposite. The public officials have responsibility to look after the poor, the marginalized, the worst off. I mean, it's something that left liberals like John Rawls would agree with, most Christians would agree with, Confucians, socialists. It's a widespread assumption that a good political system is one that looks after its least well-off citizens who don't have family or other members to look after them. So another advantage of political meritocracy is that all leaders, is that the political leaders at higher levels of government can take a long-term horizon. They could plan things 5, 10, 15 years ahead, knowing that the same political organization will be in place, and they could plan for, and they don't have to worry about being losing power, having their priorities radically changed in a few years' time, as it would be in an electoral system. So on issues like climate change, if China sets its standards now, this is what we're going to do by the year 2030, we can be pretty sure that they're going to do their best to maintain those standards. Whereas if elections were used to select leaders, obviously the priorities could totally change, right? I mean, next in the US, for example, who knows, if Donald Trump gets back into power, then you can say goodbye to all those policies meant to address climate change that have been put in place highly imperfectly by the Biden administration, for example. Also in a political meritocracy, the leaders can spend most of their time focusing on how to solve problems, how to think about what are appropriate policies to solve problems. But if elections are used to select leaders, especially in large countries like the US or India, much of the time is spent on raising money to make sure that you can get reelected again, giving the same speech over and over again to different constituents. I mean, from an ideal political view, it's a kind of waste of time, right? You want leaders to focus on policies and how to solve issues. So my point here is that political meritocracy is fully compatible with most democratic values and ideals that we know. In fact, I think more democratic values and are necessary to improve political meritocracy in China, short of one person, one vote at high levels of government, which would basically undermine the advantages of political meritocracy. Like, as mentioned, long-term perspective, all leaders have political experience, they don't have to waste time giving the same speech over and over again and raising money. Now, I also want to make a point that political meritocracy is compatible with basic human rights. I mean, what are basic human rights? Well, there's widespread consensus on, let's say, negative rights, like the right not to be tortured, the right not to be murdered, the right not to be subject to slavery or genocide. Michael Walzer calls them thin human rights. But also, sometimes we call them positive human rights, like the right to food, the right to basic material necessities. Those are relatively uncontested in the international realm. And actually, China, in principle, adheres to those as much as, for example, the United States, and India and so on. Of course, in practice, it doesn't always happen that way. But then the task, it's not a matter of morality. It's a task is to expose a gap between ideal and the reality. But the point here is that in principle, political meritocracy is fully compatible with most basic human rights. Unless, of course, you think that people have a right to select their own political leaders. If you think that that's a fundamental human rights, well, then obviously there won't be agreement on that point in China. But why should that be? I mean, in China, the ideal political meritocracy seems appropriate. I mean, it's the mainstream public culture. It's one that has a very long history. One of the questions is about the Confucian element. Actually, ever since the age of Confucius, 2,500 years ago, Confucius, he said he was conservative, that he was reinterpreting tradition, but he had some innovations too. Like the word junzi, before the age of Confucius, it would really refer to a gentleman who was there because of his family blood heritage. But he said, no, a junzi is somebody who has exemplary character and superior ability. So we can translate junzi more as exemplary person. And ever since then, literally for 2,500 years, the main argument in Chinese political culture has been over how to, well, first of all, what do we mean by superior ability? What do we mean by superior virtue? What's the relation between ability and virtue? And what are the means of assessing ability and virtue? Obviously, the most famous way of assessing ability is examinations, but that has been, for example, the Confucian Zhu Xi in the Song Dynasty criticized exams for saying it's not a good way of selecting virtue. So then we need other mechanisms of selecting virtue. How do we do that? These are long-standing arguments in Chinese history. It's really the mainstream political culture. And it's one that the people still endorse. If you look at polling results in China, people want their leaders to have a superior ability and virtue, and they'll use that ideal as a way of criticizing their leaders. For example, as mentioned, corruption is such a burning issue in China because if the leaders are corrupt, it means that political meritocracy is not working well. I mean, and it also means that the political system as a whole will lack legitimacy. Now, you might say that's true of other countries, but not necessarily. I mean, some countries, corruption is just taken for granted, and the leaders don't, and the people don't view it as a big problem because they don't hold political meritocracy as the ideal. Also, again, China is a large country, and we shouldn't use the kind of standards of what's appropriate in small countries to think of large countries. In a huge country like China, it's not a bad idea to have different ways of selecting leaders at different levels of government. As mentioned, at lower levels of government, there's a much better case for using elections where people are familiar with the character of their leaders and they can make better political judgments. And also the issues are not so complex, right? I mean, if you're in a village, the issue is, how much compensation should we get if your land is expropriated for public purposes, or where do we build a hospital? I mean, all these issues local villagers can argue about, and it makes sense to select, to use elections to select leaders at local levels. In fact, that's a common view in Western political theory as well. I mean, if you look at, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famous defender of a strong form of participatory democracy and the social contract. But when he was an advisor to Poland, which was a large country in those days, well, still is, I guess, he totally changed his ideals, and he said, and he defended something much closer to what I call political meritocracy, or what the Chinese call 贤能政治, because he thought in a large country, democracy is not going to work very well at the higher levels of government. So the point is that because of China's size, it's important to allow for different ways of selecting political leaders at different levels of government. And basically, the kind of rule of thumb is the lower level of government, the more there should be democracy, and the higher levels of government, the more there should be political meritocracy, with lots of experimentation in between. Doesn't mean there should be no democracy at higher levels, but it just means that there should be less than at lower levels. That's a perfectly reasonable way of thinking about the ideals in forming the Chinese political system. Now, so the West, I mean, why does the West have such a hard time with China? I mean, I think there's different explanations. One, as mentioned, is that they use this very crude way of dividing the political world into good democracies and bad autocracies, and China doesn't use elections to select higher leaders, therefore it's a bad autocracy. I think also sometimes there's frankly racism, just fear that a kind of non-white or a kind of strange looking country from the kind of more traditional Western point of view is rising and may challenge at least the ideal of, that the West should dominate the rest of the world. Of course, there's also some genuine worries about there's a big gap between ideal and the reality in China, which of course is shared by many Chinese intellectuals as well. But frankly, I think here the big problem is with the West, that it needs to be less dogmatic about what counts as a legitimate way of selecting leaders. We need to allow for political variations based on the size of the country, based on the dominant political culture, and based on what people want. I mean, if political meritocracy is an appropriate way of thinking about selecting leaders at higher levels of government in China, then I think the West just needs to allow that there's legitimate variation and not regard the Chinese political system as fundamentally illegitimate just because there's no advocacy or practice of the elections as a way of selecting leaders. Again, we should also recall that the West's own history, in the past, people are much more open-minded in this way. 19th century, the great British liberal, John Stuart Mill, he had some doubts about using one person, one vote for selecting leaders. He says, not everybody has equal capacity to make informed political judgments, and we should give extra votes to educated people. Now, if a British, and he was an MP, right? Remember, a member of parliament, when he could make those points of view. We don't have to agree, but some things went wrong. I mean, since post-World War II, if a leader were to make, or an intellectual were to make that point, they would be viewed as somehow outside the moral pale, because it's a very strong and frankly dogmatic consensus in the West that one person, one vote is the only morally legitimate way of selecting leaders. Doesn't depend on the size of the country, doesn't depend on history, on the mainstream political culture. It's such a weirdly dogmatic view. I'm from Canada, so I took this view as well from my mother's milk, but I've been in China now for many years, and I think hopefully I'm a bit less dogmatic and open-minded than I used to be. So thank you very much, but let's move. I'd be more than happy to discuss, and feel free to criticize, and I look forward to discussion.
Great. So, well, first, let me thank you for this comprehensive introduction, because I think it's very important to touch on all of these topics, and also to not to challenge, but in a way to set a new path, and to try to shed lights on ideas that are in a way not hidden, but at least they're not promoted in a way that they should be promoted clearly and objectively. So first, I just want to quickly remind the audience that, of course, you can pose your questions. In the end, there are going to be some Q&As from the audience, and you can send it to me, or you can just put it in the chat, and just clearly or clarify that if you want to ask you, or I can ask you for you. Just you can send it to me privately or put it in the chat, and in the end, we'll select a few, and you can just make it. So, okay, now that we know a little bit about this complex and unknown concept of political meritocracy, as you referred to it, and also as you do in your book, in the China model, that political power should be distributed in accordance with ability and virtue, right? But in this sense, it's essential to understand how it should be distributed, and this relates in a way to the characteristics of public servants to become political leaders, and also the selection process that they should follow. In your book, in the China model, you clearly in a way structure by theory and also by examples three main threads, which are, as you said in the beginning, virtue and ethics, that we should put someone who puts their life in a way to service to the public good. We should also find someone who has good social skills. Basically, they have emotional intelligence, they have empathy, self-awareness, and also someone who has intellectual ability. And in the end, you kind of like say that this order is very important to in a way give relevance to virtue, then to social skills, and then to intellectual ability. And my question is why we should in a way put at the beginning someone who has virtue, then social skills, and in the end intellectual ability.
So thank you. I mean, that's a good question. I guess one of my responses is that I think it's partly contextual. Which of those traits should matter more? It depends on what their priorities should be. For example, in China, 1980s and 90s, arguably the period of reform, there was a basic consensus that our main priority is poverty reduction. The main means of reducing poverty is economic growth. Therefore, we should select and promote leaders who have the ability to deliver economic growth. And that requires some level of IQ, obviously, to understand economic issues. It's sometimes quite complex, and high levels of EQ as well, because you have to know how to persuade people. And as a politician, that's much of what or a public officials, that's most of the time what you're trying to do. But virtue maybe was not so important in those days, so long as public officials did the work, so to speak. So what I mean here is that there's a kind of good, or let's say there's a corruption which is terrible and inexcusable in any circumstance, and there's a form of corruption which can be tolerated. Namely, if the public officials, for example, take some bribes, but they still do the work, then that might not be terrible if there's total prioritization on economic growth, and if the corruption doesn't really undermine that aim. So let's say 80s and 90s, virtue was arguably less important than, let's say, IQ and EQ. We can call that ability. But things changed. Over the past maybe 10 or 15 years, the corruption became so bad that it literally undermined the legitimacy of the whole system. the amounts of bribes were just huge, but also it was so angering ordinary people who often had to pay bribes or had to use kind of illegal means of getting their children into schools or hospitals. Everyday life just required a lot of corruption, and it was so transparently unfair. So at that point, virtue became much more important than ability. And that's part of why we have to understand the anti-corruption drive now, because corruption was literally viewed as an existential threat to the political system. So they had to change the prioritization and put virtue at the top as the main criterion for selecting and promoting public officials, with ability important, but less important than it used to be. So again, my point is that it's somewhat contextual, which is more important. Before we decide on which is more important, we have to look at the context. I mean, that said, I mean, generally speaking, for public officials, the sorts of skills that are required are different than being, for example, an academic. I mean, to be a successful academic today, for example, in fields like physics, obviously by far the most important character trait, so to speak, is intelligence and and intellectual creativity. You could work alone in an office, come up with a brilliant new theory, and you would be very successful, even if you're very low on EQ, even if you don't have good social skills, and also if you're low on virtue. It doesn't really matter that much to be a great theoretical physicist. But to be a public official, and I see this now because I work as a dean, what do we do most of the day? It's not reading books and writing. In Chinese, we say kai hui. We're constantly in meetings trying to solve problems. And the way to do that is by engaging in social interaction and trying to persuade people of different perspectives of your point of view, and also changing your point of view in response to dialogue and to those meetings. So EQ for public officials is arguably more important than IQ. And it's hard to think of counterexamples to that. I mean, I mentioned in the book, that the most successful US president, arguably in the 20th century, was Frederick Delano Roosevelt. He was successful in both peacetime and wartime, and he wasn't an intellectual, didn't necessarily have very high IQ. He himself said, I don't think he finished a book in his whole life, but he had brilliant EQ. He would let his advisors, who would tend to be brilliant, representing different perspectives, argue among themselves, come up with some sort of consensus about what's the right policy. And then the president would then use his highly superior EQ to try to persuade ordinary people in the US that those policies are the right things to do. So generally speaking, I mean, it's hard to think of counterexamples. EQ would be more important than IQ for public officials. But whether virtue is more important than ability, I would say, generally speaking, it is, but depends on the context. And there might be counterexamples to that, just like China in the 1980s. I hope that helps to answer the question.
Yeah. I think that's very, very important. That's something that from the Western perspective, we have like a really hard time to deal with constant change, right? We kind of like understand through phases, and we had like this hard times to understand that we have like a constant change, and maybe depending on the situation, you need to ponder over and say what is most important. And I think that's a really good answer, and also that kind of like helps us understand what kind of leadership is constant. There's a lot of kinds of leadership, and it depends on the context in the end. And I would like to link this answer that you gave us. The hope was also thought-provoking for the audience to send some questions, to link it with the challenges of political meritocracy. You mentioned corruption and how you link it with virtue and how to try to solve corruption. And also at the beginning of your intervention, you mentioned the issue of ossification, which I think it's something that is worrying and at the same time is very complex to solve. So in a way that political meritocracy in China is well accepted and culturally supported, the system has, as you said, some inconveniences that needs to be addressed to keep public support and keep that legitimacy. So first, you mentioned, we can just talk about a little bit of that corruption and see how maybe to put it in another way, as you said in the intervention, that progress in a way is try to narrow or to close the gap, right, between the reform and between that ideal and the reality. So maybe do you think that China is going in the right direction, or this progress is being made by having a successful relation between uplifting virtue and through virtue finding a solution for corruption, as you said, with this anti-corruption campaign? Or to put it another way, is this anti-corruption campaign actually working and having some fruitful results?
Well, I mean, definitely, if you look at what ordinary people feel and think, and it's borne out by survey results as well, the anti-corruption campaign is relatively successful, where now there's much more bribery than there used to be. And people are much more careful about engaging in activities that were previously regarded as corrupt. I mean, I see it as dean. As soon as there were new policies about 5 years ago over how much we could spend for dinner. We couldn't spend public funds on alcohol, for example. All those are relatively new, and also was very strong policies against accepting gifts of any kind. Our offices were made smaller. I mean, just to give you an example from my own experience. So I think in terms of people's perception, and I think to a certain extent the reality as well, there's been a huge progress in the anti-corruption, in reducing corruption. That said, it's led to very bad consequences. One is that public officials become much more conservative and unwilling to take risks. Before, one of the advantages of the Chinese political system is that there was an encouragement for experiments, because it's not always obvious how to solve problems. And if you give a lot of authority to lower or mid-level officials to experiment with new issues, then it's a good thing for China's development. But now, because of the anti-corruption campaign, the very harsh means that are used of dealing with corruption, many public officials become very conservative and unwilling to take risks and keep their heads down when there's trouble. And I mean, one famous case of that is when the COVID outbreak broke out in Wuhan. The local officials were trying to suppress information because they fear that it might undermine them if things get out, which of course is terrible from the point of view of medium to long-term development. So there's a need now to move from a kind of harsh means of dealing with corruption that make people overly fearful and conservative to one where there's more reliance on different methods. For example, increasing salaries is one important way of reducing corruption, having better supervisory institutions, I think more open media. All these issues are important. And also just training. There's much more emphasis now on training public officials in Confucian virtues. And the whole history of Confucianism, a very important part of it, is to train public officials who have superior virtue. And there's very rich resources in the Confucian tradition, both in terms of ideals and practices, for thinking of how that might happen. So the challenge now, I think, is to move from a kind of anti-corruption campaign that relies primarily on fear of harsh punishment to one where there's much more self-regulation. Whether that'll be successful or not, I think it's too early to tell, but that's the challenge that China finds itself now in terms of dealing with corruption. So to summarize, it's not so much, I think the results have been relatively effective, but the means employed have been much too harsh and have had bad consequences. And there's a need to rely now on less harsh means.
That's a great answer. And also because as you mentioned, sometimes legitimacy, right, it usually arises in moments of crisis or whenever this basic needs are fulfilled, but also it's like a thread that is that also arises, and its legitimacy it appears when there's low coercion, right? When there's no coercion towards the people and also public officials, and things are happening organically. So I think that's a really good answer, and I would like to link these ideas that you gave us of these different challenges, and also how to select leaders with I think, which is the main point, and which is the main idea that you argue, and that also in a way structures a new way of thinking, or a new way of political system, very accessible to people from the West who's not used to read or to deal with Chinese social political concepts. And I would like to draw upon the models of democratic meritocracy, because I think that's very, very important. And as we said, China, and as you put in your book, and I think that's I've never read that before, and I think that's a very nice way to put it. That is, China understands democracy in procedural but substantive terms. In other words, that government for the people is government for the people by elites, but not by the people. And I think that's a very way of linking meritocracy and democracy, and kind of like shift and debate between democracy and autocracy and authoritarianism, and live it apart. So my question in the end, as you mentioned, if maybe you could elaborate on this vertical system that you explain of meritocracy at the top, experimentation in between, and democracy at the bottom, so we could grasp how meritocracy and democracy relates in a political structure.
Well, so I'm going to use the definition of democracy that's widely accepted in the West, where it originated, which is that government by the people. I mean, actually, in China, it's true that if you look at polls and you ask people about democracy, like Minzhu, even my own students, they think first and foremost that it's government for the people. Wei Renmin Fu. Obviously, that's a good part of, any form of good government should be for the people, but it doesn't have to be democratic. I mean, it could be a non-democratic government, for example, a great monarch could be for the people. So to really capture what's distinctive about democracy, I do think that we need to use this definition of the government by the people. But but again, my point here is that government by the people, it needn't mean only in elections as a way of selecting political leaders. I mean, that's part of the story. And in China, as mentioned, at the village level, hundreds of millions of farmers use elections to select their leaders. And also in different levels of government, there's also, for example, just to give you a simple example of my own experience as dean, when we select leaders we also have a form of collective leadership here. We have 4 vice deans and 3 party secretaries. And to choose the next set of leaders, we have voting, and we have to rank, and we have to assess people's performance. And then all that information is given to the Department of Organization, which then makes a decision partly based on our kind of votes. In fact, usually, I mean, it's hard to know to what extent, but the votes are an important part of that process. So the point is that at local levels of government, or at least where there's a small face-to-face interaction with people, and where they're more likely to make more informed judgments about the ability and character of their peers, then it makes sense to use elections as a way of selecting leaders. And I think China does that, not just in villages, but as mentioned, in universities and other kind of institutions of that kind. Now, but we shouldn't limit democracy, and even if we define democracy as governed by the people, just in terms of elections. If people have a lot of say in the way that policies are implemented, if there's a lot of consultation, that's important. Also, there's different ways of organizing democratic decision making. I mean, there's the practice of sortition, or using kind of randomly selecting people and then putting them and then letting them decide. Of course, the ancient Greeks thought it was more democratic than elections because everybody has an equal chance of being participating in government. That's also a very important way of selecting leaders. There are some experiments with democratic polling in China, which use a mixture of sortition and expert consultation as a way of deciding on policies. There's even like some of the traditional socialist ideas of the mass line. I mean, we can argue that it didn't always work well in practice, but in theory, it was meant to be, where the public officials would go to the grassroots, find out what people want and think, and partly based on that information, would try to come up with ways of solving problems of local people. I mean, all these are democratic practices which can complement, if not replace, elections in points. But the point here is that democracy by the people works best in small settings where people have a basic ability and are better informed when it comes to assessing the character and ability of the leaders to be selected, and also where the issues are not so complex and don't require years of training and also sometimes expertise. So that's the basic model in China. Again, there's a big gap between ideal and reality. At lower levels of government, more democratic practices. As you go up the chain of government, more emphasis on political meritocracy. I see here there's a couple of questions. Maybe I should take a little bit of time to try to respond to them. One is really a question about China and Marxism. And this is really interesting because even like if you look at some of what I wrote in China's New Confucianism in 2008, I said that Marxism is dead. It's going to be replaced by Confucianism. Now, ironically, at that very same time, Marxism started its comeback, and it's made a very strong comeback since then. So I think both Confucianism and Marxism are going to be part of the kind of ideals that will inform political change in the future. Now, why has Marxism made a comeback? Well, because parts of the problems now in China that need to be addressed are ones that have traditionally concerned socialist and Marxist thinkers, the huge gap between rich and poor, which of course is bad for political meritocracy as well, because it means that if you're from a kind of poor rural household, you don't get access to good teachers, you don't have enough resources to get a good education, and then you don't have an equal opportunity to be put on the road to political power. So to have better political meritocracy, we also need to reduce the gap between rich and poor. But obviously, generally speaking, if there's a big gap between rich and poor, and people are committed to kind of more egalitarian ideals, as happens to be the case in China, then the Marxist and socialist traditions have a lot to offer. That's part of why the Marxist tradition is coming back. Now, what hasn't really changed, though, is a bit of skepticism about the final aim of Marxism. Now, you'll remember that Karl Marx's idea of higher communism, the productive force would be highly developed, there'd be lots of resources, people wouldn't have to fight for scarce resources anymore, there wouldn't be classes in society, and there'd be no need for coercive government anymore, for coercive state, because there's enough resources to be around, people wouldn't need to fight for scarce resources. Now, the idea the state is going to wither away is not really on the agenda here. Why is that? Well, there's different reasons. One is the development of artificial intelligence. I discussed that in my latest book with Wang, where artificial intelligence, in a way, it also helps explain why Marxism is coming back, because arguably several decades from now, much of the dirty and dangerous work that should be replaced by advanced machinery in Marx's kind of ideal, that might happen because of AI. AI can replace the dirty and necessary labor that people don't want to do, and then be free to develop their creative talents. That's the kind of Marxist ideal. But Marx didn't anticipate the idea that AI can go rogue, that AI can become more intelligent than human beings and could eventually turn us into slaves, as opposed to we using machinery as kind of slaves or servants for our purposes. For that reason, arguably, there's always going to be a need for a state with the ability to maintain a dominance, let's say, not of one class, but of the human beings over advanced machinery. That's one reason why the state's not going to wither away. Of course, other reasons are that other countries, like the US, so long as it's committed to capitalist, way of organizing the economy, then China will need a coercive state to, basically to protect itself against that form of economic and political organization. Marx himself said that communism isn't going to work unless it's a global thing. So unless the rest of the world becomes Marxist, the coercive state in China is here to stay. There's another question about, can you have political meritocracy in a multi-party system? I mean, that's a good question. If the parties have ways of selecting and training political leaders over several decades. And there's not a huge difference between the orientation of political parties, then it might be, then the advantages of, the disadvantages of elections might not be so bad, because all leaders who are selected will have some political experience because they've been part of that training process within the political party. Like in Germany, for example, traditionally political parties have developed in this way, as well as are in some countries like Norway, although that system's breaking down now. And also, because there's no huge difference between the political parties, you can assume that plans that are meant to be 10 or 15 years or more will remain in place, even if there's a change of political parties. So in that sort of context, it's possible to reconcile multi-party system with political meritocracy. But it's quite unusual context, frankly, and things are getting much worse in democracies where the political, especially the large democracies, where the political parties are getting much more polarized. And it's a case that if one party wins, then it'll totally undermine the priorities of the other party. So you can kiss goodbye to long-term planning. And also now where the whole party system of training political leaders is breaking down, where you can have these, populists with no political experience assuming political power, which of course also undermines the advantages of political meritocracy. So if you look at the trends in democracies today, they're unfavorable to political meritocracies, or let's say multi-party democracies. But in principle, it's possible to have political parties if there's no huge difference in political orientation, and if the parties themselves emphasize the training of political leaders, then there's no strong contradiction between political meritocracy and democracy. That's one question. Okay, and sorry about Confucianism and Marxism, are they really incompatible? It depends, really. One of the assumptions of Marxism is that the first task of government is to reduce poverty. Now, that's also very, very long tradition. Has a very long tradition in Confucianism too. I mean, Mencius, again, 2,300 years ago, he was very clear that the first task of government is to look after the poor and marginalized members of society, those especially who lack family members, to look after them. They need the help of the government. In the West, you didn't have such ideas until much, much later in the 18th century. Also, the idea that the state needs to focus on the distribution of land to make sure that it's more equitably distributed. There's much, that's also been part of the Confucian tradition. So you can even argue that the parts of the Marxist tradition that took hold in China, arguably, are the ones that were consistent with these longer and deeper Confucian traditions. That said, I mean, there are some differences. And I mean, the most important difference is that Marxism ultimately is a kind of enlightenment view that people, the most important thing for people is to have the freedom to develop their creative talents. Now, Confucians don't deny that, but for Confucians, they say the most important thing is to have rich and diverse social relations that give meaning to people's lives. Those two things sometimes can be in tension, and that's really the main incompatibility between Confucianism and Marxism. But arguably, they should complement each other and then always be in tension.
So, well, thank you, Daniel, for taking the lead in the comments questions. They were very interesting questions, touching on very different topics, and I think we just have one more. I think is Tim, who, yeah, you can go and ask your question. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I've personally found both the China model and Just Hierarchy very, very interesting reads. For me personally, perhaps I found Just Hierarchy even more interesting because of the implications of some of the ideas that you brought forward for our personal lives, such as the cases in which hierarchies in our private lives are justified, which I found very interesting. I guess my main question is, I had like a whole page of questions, which I had to narrow down to one. so my main question is, seeing as in your book, The China Model, you touched upon the question of the bad emperor. What do you do about him? And in the past and before Xi Jinping kind of abolished the two-term limit, that was kind of the way to limit the power of the people at the very top. And kind of in this context, my question would be, what changes you have observed over the past 7 years since you wrote that book in concerns to the meritocratic mechanisms?
Thank you. Well, I mean, obviously, so this one important disadvantage of the political meritocracy is that there's no obvious way of limiting the power of leaders. In elections, obviously one important virtue is that every few years the leader can change, the people, at least in principle, can change leaders that they don't like. So China had a disastrous experience with arbitrary dictatorship in the Cultural Revolution, where a kind of, a leader who may have been good earlier basically devolved into an extreme personality cult and launched a very chaotic kind of system, well, not system, let's say anti-system, over a 10-year period that was led to, certainly there's a almost consensus that it led to terrible consequences in China. So when Deng Xiaoping and other leaders took power in 1979, they wanted to implement policies that limited the possibility of this arbitrary one-man dictatorship. And one of the mechanisms, as you mentioned, was term limits, for example, for presidents. And that seemed to work pretty well as one mechanism. But as you know, we don't know for sure, but at least in principle, the term limits for presidents have been abolished, and it's possible that the current leader may assume a third term. But it's worth noting that term limits is not the only way of limiting the power of leaders. Another hugely important mechanism, and one that I see not just at higher levels of government, but at lower levels, as mentioned in my university as well, and even in my faculty, is collective leadership, where it's not one person who just sits in a chair, a throne, and decides on policies. The policies are discussed in a collective setting repeatedly over and over again, with each person having some sort of say. And though it might not be equal, as one person might have more authority than others, but in principle, in a collective leadership system, things get aired, different perspectives are aired, different criticisms are aired, and some sort of informal consensus develops that allows for those policies to be implemented, and that prevents crazy ideas from ever taking hold. Now, I see it in my faculty. I think collective leadership works pretty well. We don't know exactly how it works at the highest levels of government because there's very little transparency, but we can basically assume that even though the current leader has more power relative than other members of the collective leadership, but other members of collective leadership have substantial power. And if they were to strongly disagree with the view of the current leader, it's unlikely that the current leader would get his way. Or if the current leader were to become, let's just say, senile, which is always, it's possible as people get older, right? Then arguably he wouldn't be allowed to continue given the system of collective leadership. So as I see it, the system of collective leadership is still very important to prevent the bad emperor problem, so to speak. But if that goes away, then I would worry much more than I worry now.
Thank you very much.
Well, so thank you, Tim, for your question. I think is very important, and it draws upon some key issues that are also criticized and not very objectively, but in the Western worldwide media. And maybe to close up and to have like a nice wrap up, I have like a last question, which is more maybe motivational and is maybe not that related to this in a way theoretical concepts, that what is your advice, or what is your motivational comment for the people who's in this room who are maybe doing their university studies, or have already graduated, or trying to find a job? What is your advice if people is actually committed to learn and to, in a way, narrow the gap between the West and China, in order to have well-informed and, in a way, objective China-West debates? What is your advice? What steps we should take, and what should be our attitude?
Well, that's so obviously it's very important to come to China and to have personal experience. Unfortunately, with COVID policies, the international borders are closed and are likely to remain closed for the next year. I desperately hope that the borders will reopen in 2023. And if the borders reopen, then I would strongly encourage you to come, China, not just go to Beijing, but China is such a huge and diverse country. You know, you can go to different parts of China and spend a long time in one particular place, and get to know it as part of your research, ideally through some local contacts as well. So it's important too to learn the language. Obviously, if you come to China, to communicate in Chinese, but also because much of the material that's challenges or that's different than the kind of typical Western views are written in Chinese. And of course, there's heavy censorship in China, and that's a bad thing, and I hope that that'll change. Nonetheless, there's still a lot that gets published in Chinese in periodicals and in books that offer fascinating perspectives that are different than what you would get in the West. So those would be the two main. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I'm not saying anything new, but coming to China, learning a language, and reading in Chinese stuff that's that China people in China thinking about, I think is very important to get diverse perspectives. Yeah, and also it's worth that it's not just about the West and China, right? I mean, there's lots of fascinating areas of research now, for example, about China's growing influence in the Middle East, or China's ties with India. I mean, these are all fascinating areas that need to be explored much more so than they have been so far.
Well, just thank you for your answer. I think in the end, sometimes you get, in a way, in this bubble, from the West maybe, or whatever people is based on, and I think that it's important to try to maybe step out from that comfort zone and try to, I don't know, find yourself in different situations and learn from your mistakes when communicating, when learning, when talking to other people. And so I think those are wonderful advices for people who wants to work on this field and try to create well-informed debates. So with this answer and these comments, I would like to say goodbye. I would like to thank you, Daniel, for answering and for taking some of your time for answering these questions. We have seen people in the audience as team who actually have read your books and have like some long and very good questions, and also for people in the audience who has actually spent time with us, and hope you have learned and you have get some motivation to keep on learning about this and having your in a way your thoughts order. So I just wanted to say thank you. Hope we can see you again in another European Wang webinar, and stay tuned, because more events and more things are on their way. So thank you.
Okay.